Welcome to Congruent Triangles. So today we're going to start by talking about what congruent triangles are and how you can show that they are congruent. So the definition of congruent is that we have the same size and same shape. So what's important about knowing things are congruent? In order to know that triangles or any kind of shape are congruent at this time, is you need to know that all their corresponding parts are congruent. So corresponding parts are just all of their matching parts. So as you see here, I have to know that angle A is congruent to angle H. They are marked the same. So they're marked here the same. And then we have angle B is marked the same as angle J. And then angle C is marked the same as angle K. And then it also tells me that AB is marked the same as HJ, BC is marked the same as KJ, and then AC is marked the same as HK. Since I know all three sides and all three angles are congruent in each triangle, I know they're congruent. It is important to know how to name them properly as well. You can name the first triangle however you want, so in this case was triangle ABC. But the way you name the second triangle can be right or wrong. That the first letter has to match with the first letter. So A with A, so B is congruent to J, and then C with K. So those do have to be named properly. So let's look at an example. So if I want to identify corresponding congruent parts, we need to see what matches up. So we're going to start with angles. Please know since I have pentagons, there are 10 different parts. There's 5 sides and there's 5 angles. So let's start with the angles. So I need to say that angle A is congruent to angle R. And then angle B is congruent to angle T. And angle C is congruent to angle P. Angle D is congruent to angle S, and angle E is congruent to angle Q. So that's all 5 angles. Now, I also need to know that all 5 sides are congruent. So I need to name them as well. So if I start with side AB is congruent to side RT. And then work my way around. Side BC is congruent to side TP. Side CD is congruent to side PS. Then side DE is congruent to side SQ. And then side AE is congruent to side RQ. So I have now named all the angles and all the sides. So then I'm going to write a congruent statement. So to name a polygon, I just go ahead and start with one letter and then work my way around the polygon. So in this case, I would say A, B, C, D, CDE, is congruent to, now I know A matched with R, so it has to go first. B matched with T, C matched with P, D matched with S, and E matched with Q. So it has to be in the same order in both of them, otherwise it's wrong. So I want you to go ahead and look at this question here. The support beams on the fence form congruent triangles. In the figure, it tells you that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Which of the following congruent statements correctly identifies corresponding angles or sides? So be very careful to see which one of these statements over here matches correctly with what we have over here. Or, the easiest way, look at how these are named and make sure they have it matched up correctly. Okay, next thing we need to talk about with congruent triangles is knowing that if the triangles are congruent. So in the diagram, triangle ITP is congruent to triangle NGO. Find the values of x and y. Well, if they're congruent, this automatically tells me what matches up. So if I want to find x and y, I'm going to go ahead and find what do I have for x. Well, x, I have a statement that has a y in it as well, so my guess is I need to find y first. Well, y is angle O, so I see angle O is the last letter here. So I need to look and see what it should match with from the statement. So since P is the last letter here, then that should be what matches with O. So I see that angle P is 40 degrees. So I can write the equation 6y minus 14 equals 40. And then I can solve it by adding 14 to each side. So 6y equals 54. Then I divide by 6. So y equals 9. So now what I can do is I see that my x here is for NG. So again, I see NG is the first two letters. So I see the first two letters in the other triangle is IT. So I know NG matches with IT. So x minus 2, and then I now know that y is 9, has got to equal the one that is IT, so that is 7.5. So I'm going to solve this. 2 times 9 would give me 18, so x minus 18 equals 7.5. So I add 18 to both sides. And that gives me 25.5. So for once we couldn't find x first, we had to find y first. All right, let's go on. So the next thing we need to look at is this. I want you to try and see if you can start with some equations for x and y. When here is our congruent statement for the triangles. Okay, so now that you have that, last thing we need to talk about is the third angles theorem. Third angles theorem says if I have two angles congruent to two angles in another triangle, so I see that angle C is congruent to K and angle B is congruent to angle J, it tells me that the angles that are left, in this case angle A and angle L, are also congruent. So let's see when else this would be helpful. So I'm going to have to draw in some of these symbols. If this should be triangle, IJK is congruent to triangle. Sorry, these should be angles. Let me start that again. If angle IJK is congruent to angle IKJ, and the measure of angle IJK is 72, I want to find the measure of angle JIH. So, I to J to K would be this angle here, is congruent to I to K to J. So it's congruent to that angle there. And I know IJK is 72. It wants the measure of JIH. So we're now looking for this angle out here, JIH. So if I know that these two angles here are 72, then I could find the measure of the angle up here. Okay, so because it tells me in here that all these triangles are congruent, I can use the 180 rule and do 72 plus 72, which would give me 144, and do 180 minus 144, which would give me 36. So that means that this angle up here is 36. Since I know that all three of these triangles here are congruent, that means the angle up here must also be 36. Last thing I want to talk about is a triangle proof. This one actually is not too many steps, that we still put the given at the beginning. So the angle L is congruent to angle P. LM is congruent to PO. LN is congruent to PN. And MN is congruent to OP. That is all you're given. I want to prove that they're both congruent. Well, remember at the beginning, the only way I can show that two things are congruent is if I know all the angles and all the sides are congruent. So one thing I want to look at, if you remember I told you that vertical angles are very important in this chapter, so I see a pair of vertical angles here. So that's going to be my next statement, is that I have to name those two vertical angles. So it would start with, I have to use my three letters. So from L to N to M. So angle LNM is congruent to angle. Then we need to go from O to N to P. So angle ONP. I know those are vertical angles, so you can call it vertical angle theorem, or just vertical angles is perfectly fine. Now that I know that two angles in one triangle are the same as two angles in another triangle, we can use that third angle theorem to say that angle M is congruent to angle O. So that would be your third angle theorem. I already know all the sides are congruent, so I can now go ahead and say that triangle LMN is congruent to triangle PON. Now the reason on this, the only reason we have, is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, and we call that CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So if all the parts are the same, that means that the triangles are also the same.